Imagine a world before farming. No wheat fields, no villages, no pottery, no metal. Just small bands of hunter-gatherers moving through a harsh landscape, living by their wits and whatever the season offered. Now imagine those same people carving and hauling stone pillars that weigh as much as a modern truck, arranging them into towering circles, and decorating them with razor-sharp images of predators, snakes, and strange symbols that still won't fully give up their meaning. That place is real. It's called Göbekli Tepe, and it's about 12,000 years old. It shouldn't exist. Not according to the old story of human history. For generations, we told ourselves a neat, comforting timeline. First, humans hunted and gathered. Then they learned to farm. Then they settled down. Then they built temples and monuments. Civilization, we thought, was the reward for agriculture. Göbekli Tepe flips that story like a table, because here, on a windswept hill in southeastern Anatolia, people who supposedly lacked the organization, the food surplus, and the need for monumental architecture built something that looks disturbingly like a temple complex. Not a hut, not a camp. A sacred landscape of stone. And they did it at the very moment humanity was supposed to be taking its first uncertain steps out of the Ice Age. If you want to know when the human mind changed, when we began to think in big, abstract, communal ways, Göbekli Tepe is one of the most haunting places to look. It's as if history left a door cracked open for a second, and then slammed it shut again, burying the evidence. Because that's the other part of the mystery. After building these massive stone circles, after returning again and again to this hilltop, the people of Göbekli Tepe did something no one expected. They deliberately buried it. They filled their own monuments with rubble, animal bones, and soil, sealing them like time capsules. And then they walked away. What kind of society builds a wonder of the ancient world, and then entombs it with their own hands? To understand why Göbekli Tepe is so unsettling, we have to go back. Back before writing, before cities, before kings and armies. Back to a time when the world was changing faster than humans had ever seen. Around 12,000 years ago, the last ice age was loosening its grip. Glaciers were retreating. Sea levels were rising. The climate was swinging wildly, sometimes warming, sometimes snapping back into cold. In this unstable world, people lived in small groups, following migrating herds and seasonal plants. They knew the land intimately. They knew the habits of gazelle and wild cattle. They knew where almonds ripened, where water pooled, where flint could be found for blades. And in the region we now call the Fertile Crescent, stretching across parts of modern Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and beyond, wild grains grew thick. Not domesticated yet, not planted in neat rows, but abundant enough that people could harvest them, grind them, and make something that was starting to change everything. A reliable calorie base. It wasn't farming yet, but it was a hint, a promise. And promises are powerful. Somewhere in this shifting world, communities began to gather, not just to survive, but to do something else. Something that demanded cooperation on a scale far beyond a single family. Something that required planning, authority, shared belief, and a reason to keep showing up. Göbekli Tepe sits on a high ridge, a place you can see from far away. Even today, it feels like a chosen spot, a landmark, a beacon. If you were traveling across the plains, you'd notice that hill. You'd remember it. You'd aim for it. And when you arrived in the ancient world, you wouldn't find a village. You'd find stone. Not the kind of stone you casually stack for a fire pit, but enormous T-shaped pillars, some towering over a person, some far taller, carved from the local limestone bedrock. They stand in circles, like frozen gatherings. Many are decorated with animals so vivid you can almost feel them moving. Foxes, boars, cranes, scorpions, vultures, snakes coiling across the surface. And then there are the central pillars, two massive T-shaped monoliths at the heart of each enclosure, facing each other like silent giants. On some, you can see carved arms running down the sides, hands meeting at the front, as if these pillars are not just pillars at all, but stylized human figures. Not portraits exactly, more like beings, presences, the kind of presence you feel in your chest before you can explain it. If you're used to thinking of prehistory as crude and simple, Göbekli Tepe hits like a shock. The craftsmanship is controlled. The composition is deliberate. The iconography is consistent enough to suggest shared meaning. and the sheer effort required to build it forces a question that refuses to go away. Who organized this? Because to quarry and move these stones, you need labor, you need coordination, you need tools, you need food to feed workers who aren't hunting that day. You need leadership, even if it isn't a king. You need a social structure strong enough to keep people cooperating when cooperation is hard. And yet, Göbekli Tepe seems to come from a world before permanent settlement. That contradiction is the heart of its power. The modern rediscovery of Göbekli Tepe begins like many great archaeological stories, with a place that was seen, dismissed, and then seen again with new eyes. In the 1960s, surveyors noted something on this hill. Stones, worked pieces. But the area was thought to be a Byzantine cemetery or some later ruin. Nobody suspected that beneath the surface lay one of the oldest monumental sites on Earth. Decades later, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived, took one look at the protruding limestone blocks, and understood something was wrong, in the best possible way. These weren't random stones. They were tops of pillars. The hill wasn't a natural formation at all. It was an artificial mound, built up over time. And when excavations began, the ground gave up its secret slowly, like a story it had been holding in its mouth for millennia. Circle after circle emerged. Not one temple, but many enclosures, layered, rebuilt, and expanded. Each excavation revealed more pillars, more carvings, more evidence that this wasn't a one-time project. This was a tradition. The earliest layers date back to around 9,600 BCE, give or take, astonishingly early. To put that into perspective, Stonehenge is a baby compared to this. The Great Pyramid of Giza is unimaginably recent by comparison. Göbekli Tepe was already ancient when the first cities rose in Mesopotamia. So what was it? Calling it a temple is tempting, because the architecture feels ritualistic. The circles feel like sanctuaries. The lack of ordinary domestic debris, hearths, trash pits typical of daily living, suggests this wasn't a village where people slept and cooked every night. It feels like a place you go to, not a place you live in. A gathering site, a ceremonial center, a sacred hill. But even that word, sacred, carries assumptions from later religions. Göbekli Tepe predates organized religion as we usually imagine it. There are no written prayers, no named gods, no myths recorded in ink. What we have are stones and symbols, and the human instinct to ask what they meant. The animals carved at Göbekli Tepe aren't the cozy creatures of a pastoral life. They're not sheep and goats in a calm field. They're wild, many are dangerous, many are predators. It's a bestiary of tension, teeth, claws, stingers. Snakes slither across multiple pillars as if they belong to the place. Scorpions crouch, boars bristle, foxes prowl. Why carve these? One possibility is that these animals were not just animals, they were signs, clans, spirits, warnings, totems, stories. Maybe each group that came to Göbekli Tepe had its own emblem, its own creature, its own identity. And here, in stone, those identities were displayed and negotiated. Another possibility is that the carvings reflect a worldview where the boundary between human and animal was thinner than ours. In a hunter-gatherer world, animals are not background. They are rivals, teachers, food, threat, mystery. You track them, you fear them, you depend on them, you imitate them. They fill your dreams, they become your metaphors. And then there are the vultures. One of the most striking images associated with this region and time is the vulture motif, birds hovering near headless bodies or carrying something that looks like a sphere. In later nearby sites, there's evidence that people practiced excarnation, leaving bodies exposed so birds could strip the flesh, then collecting bones. It's a kind of sky burial, a way of returning a person to the cycle of nature. If something like that was happening here, Göbekli Tepe might have been linked to death rituals, ancestor veneration, or beliefs about the soul's journey. A place where the living met the dead, where memory was made physical. But Göbekli Tepe also feels like a place of life, of feasting, of gathering, of noise and movement. Because amid the fill used to bury the enclosures, archaeologists found huge quantities of animal bones, gazelle, wild cattle, boar, evidence of butchery, evidence of consumption. Not a quiet shrine where only a few priests whispered in the dark, but a place where crowds may have come, ate together, and performed something communal. Imagine the scene. It's dawn, and people are arriving from different valleys and ridges, traveling for days. They bring news, disputes, marriages, alliances. They bring gifts, obsidian blades, carved beads, maybe baskets of gathered grain. They bring stories of hunts and losses. They bring the weight of winter and the hope of spring. On the hilltop, the stone circles stand waiting. Fires are lit. Meat is prepared. The air fills with smoke and the sharp scent of blood. Drums, maybe. Flutes, maybe. Or simply the rhythm of feet and voices. And in the center of the enclosure, between those towering pillars shaped like beings, something happens that binds the group together. A ritual, a vow, a remembrance, a negotiation with forces they cannot control. And this is where Göbekli Tepe becomes even more radical. Because if hunter-gatherers were gathering in large numbers for ritual feasts, then belief, shared symbolic life, may have been the engine that drove people to settle down, not the other way around. The old model said, agriculture creates surplus, surplus creates specialists, specialists create priests, priests create temples. Göbekli Tepe suggests a different sequence. Temples, or at least monumental ritual sites, may have come first. The need to gather, to feed crowds, to host repeated ceremonies may have pressured people to manage food more intensively, to harvest wild grains more systematically, to encourage certain plants to grow near camp, to begin the slow process of domestication. In other words, religion, or something like it, might have helped invent agriculture. It's a startling idea, and it doesn't mean everyone agrees. But Göbekli Tepe makes it impossible to dismiss, because the labor involved is staggering. Some pillars weigh many tons. To extract them from bedrock, shape them with stone tools, and transport them across uneven ground, you'd need dozens of people at least, maybe far more. You'd need ropes, sledges, leverage, planning. You'd need a reason strong enough to make people do backbreaking work without wages, without a state, without written contracts. Belief can be that reason. So can social competition. So can the desire for status, for legacy, for outdoing rival groups. Göbekli Tepe might have been a stage where communities competed through construction. Bigger enclosures, more impressive pillars, more elaborate carvings. A monument not to a god, but to human ambition and identity. And yet, the site doesn't feel like mere vanity. It feels like reverence, like fear, like awe. The T-shape of the pillars is one of the strangest features. At first glance, they look abstract, like giant stone hammers. But once you see the carved arms and hands on certain pillars, the illusion breaks. These are bodies, upright figures. The horizontal top could represent shoulders or a head. But there are no faces, no eyes, no mouths. Just presence. It's as if the builders wanted to represent beings that were human-like, but not human. Ancestors without individuality. Spirits without names. Entities that are meant to be felt, not recognized. And the circles themselves, walls of stone enclosing the pillars, create a sense of separation. Inside is different from outside. Inside is ordered. Outside is the wild. That contrast matters in a world where nature dominates everything, where storms can kill you, where predators stalk, where sickness has no cure. Creating an ordered sacred space might have been a way of pushing back against chaos, a way of saying, here, we decide the rules. But Göbekli Tepe wasn't built once. It was built, used, and then built again. Over time, new enclosures were constructed, sometimes overlapping older ones. The style changes subtly. The later phases use smaller stones, more walls, less emphasis on gigantic pillars. Something shifts. Perhaps the society around it is shifting too. And then comes the most baffling act of all, the burial. At some point, the builders began filling in their own enclosures. They didn't abandon the site to erosion. They didn't let it collapse slowly. They packed it with material, stone chips, dirt, bones, broken tools, until the pillars were swallowed. It was intentional, careful, repeated. Why would they do that? One possibility is that it was a ritual closure, a way to retire a sacred space when its time was done. In many cultures, holy objects are not simply thrown away. They are buried, hidden, returned to the earth with respect. Perhaps each enclosure had a lifespan, and when it ended, it was entombed, and a new one was built. Another possibility is darker. Maybe the world changed and the site became dangerous, politically, spiritually, socially. Perhaps new beliefs rose and old ones had to be sealed away. Perhaps conflict erupted and burying the monuments was an act of protection, hide the sacred from enemies. Or perhaps it was practical. The mound grew as enclosures were filled, creating a higher, more prominent hilltop for new construction. A literal layering of tradition, each generation building on the buried bones of the last. Whatever the reason, the result is extraordinary. By burying their own monuments, the builders preserved them. They protected the carvings from weather for thousands of years. They turned their sacred site into an archaeological vault. And so, Göbekli Tepe waited. Empires rose and fell around it. Languages were born and died. Religions spread, split, and transformed. The wheel was invented. Bronze was poured. Iron was forged. Armies marched. Cities burned. And through it all, this hill remained, quiet, holding its secret. When we dig it up now, we aren't just uncovering stones. We're uncovering a moment in the human story that we didn't know existed. But the deeper you go into Göbekli Tepe, the more questions multiply. If this wasn't a village, where did the builders live? Perhaps in temporary camps nearby, leaving little trace. Perhaps in small settlements that haven't been found yet, or were built in ways that didn't preserve well. Perhaps the landscape itself was their home, and Göbekli Tepe was their meeting point. How many people were involved? A few dozen specialists? Hundreds of seasonal visitors? Did people travel from far away? Evidence from materials suggests long-distance connections. Obsidian, for example, comes from volcanic regions that are not right next door. That implies networks, trade, exchange, movement of ideas. And then there's the question of leadership. Someone had to decide where pillars went. Someone had to coordinate quarrying and carving. Someone had to enforce a plan across time. Was it a council of elders? Charismatic ritual leaders? A class of specialists, proto-priests, who held knowledge and authority? Göbekli Tepe hints at hierarchy, but not the kind we recognize from later states. There are no palaces, no royal tombs, no written laws. If power existed here, it may have been performed rather than imposed, earned through ritual knowledge, persuasion, reputation, and the ability to mobilize people. And mobilization is the key word. Because once humans learn to mobilize at scale, everything changes. Large coordinated projects create new social pressures. You need rules. You need conflict resolution. You need ways to reward cooperation and punish betrayal. You need shared myths to keep people aligned. Monuments don't just reflect society, they shape it. So Göbekli Tepe may not simply be evidence of an early religious site. It may be evidence of the social technology that made civilization possible, the ability to unite strangers under a shared symbolic banner. In that sense, the carvings are not decoration. They are communication. They are identity. They are the language of a world before writing. Look closely at the imagery and you see patterns. Certain animals repeat. Certain compositions appear across pillars. Some scenes feel like narratives, as if events are being depicted, maybe myths, maybe rituals, maybe warnings. And there are abstract symbols too, marks that could be clan signs, counting systems, or something we haven't learned to read. It's tempting to project modern ideas onto them, constellations, calendars, prophecies, but the truth is more unsettling. We don't know. We are staring at a message from people who lived before our categories, before our institutions, before our assumptions about what humans should be capable of. And yet, they were capable. They were capable of planning across years, of teaching apprentices to carve stone, of maintaining a sacred tradition, of organizing feasts, of gathering hundreds of people without roads, without beasts of burden, without writing. That should humble us, because it suggests that the leap to civilization wasn't simply a matter of inventing farming tools. It was a matter of inventing meaning big enough to bind people together. Now, there's another layer to Göbekli Tepe that makes it feel almost like a myth: the timing. This site appears right at the threshold of the Holocene, the geological epoch of warmer, more stable climate that allowed agriculture and cities to flourish. It's as if, at the moment the world became more predictable, humans responded not just with new tools, but with new dreams, new fears, new rituals to negotiate their place in a changing cosmos. And if you stand mentally on that hilltop, you can feel the tension of that time. You can feel a world where old survival patterns are still necessary, hunting, gathering, mobility, but where something new is pulling at the edges of life. Bigger gatherings, more complex relationships, the beginnings of ownership, of territory, of stored resources, the first seeds of inequality, the first need for systems. Göbekli Tepe might be the sound of that transition happening in stone. But the story doesn't end with wonder. It ends with disappearance. Because after centuries of use, Göbekli Tepe is buried and abandoned. The tradition fades. The hill becomes just another rise in the landscape. People in later millennia farm nearby, build their own settlements, live their lives, never suspecting that beneath their feet lies a buried cathedral from the dawn of human society. And that raises a final, haunting possibility. What if Göbekli Tepe isn't unique? What if it's simply the first of its kind we've found? If a hunter-gatherer society could build this, how many other sacred centers might have existed, now eroded, drowned by rising seas, or still hidden under fields and towns? How many chapters of early human culture are missing because we didn't know to look for them? Göbekli Tepe forces us to confront the fragility of the record. History is not what happened. History is what survived. And what survived here is enough to rewrite the script. Because the old story painted early humans as simple, reactive creatures who stumbled into civilization by accident once farming made it possible. Göbekli Tepe suggests early humans were already capable of sophisticated symbolic thought and large-scale cooperation, and that these might have been the very forces that drove them toward agriculture and settlement. In this view, civilization wasn't just built on bread, it was built on belief, on shared imagination, on the ability to gather around an idea that exists only in the mind, and then carve that idea into stone so it can outlast any one person, any one generation. That is a terrifying power, and it's also the power that defines us. Even now, we build monuments, we gather in crowds, we create symbols that unite and divide. We tell stories that make strangers feel like family and make neighbors feel like enemies. The technology has changed, but the mechanism is ancient. Göbekli Tepe is not just an archaeological site, it's a mirror. It reflects a version of humanity we don't always like to admit, that before we had cities, we had ceremony. Before we had laws, we had ritual. Before we had writing, we had symbols carved deep enough to survive 12,000 years. And when you think about those pillars, faceless, towering, heavy with animals and meaning, you realize how close we still are to that world. We are still the species that looks into the chaos of nature and asks for a pattern. We are still the species that gathers on a hilltop, real or metaphorical, and decides that this place matters more than any other. We are still the species that buries its secrets and leaves messages for the future without knowing who will read them. Göbekli Tepe waited 12,000 years for us to arrive with our questions, and the most unsettling part is that it answers the biggest one immediately. Were people back then capable of building the foundations of civilization? Yes, they were. The real mystery is why they did it, what they believed they were touching when they stepped into those stone circles, and what kind of world you have to live in to build a temple before you build a town. Because once you accept Göbekli Tepe as real, you can't go back to the old timeline. You can't unsee the implication that the first great human revolution may not have been farming or cities or writing. It may have been the moment we learned to gather around an invisible idea and make it stronger than hunger, stronger than fear, stronger than the need to keep moving. A hill, a circle of stones, animals carved in silence, and the echo of a truth we're still living with today. Human history isn't only the story of tools and survival. It's the story of meaning. And Göbekli Tepe is where that story rises from the ground, stares at us across 12 millennia, and quietly dares us to explain it.
If you liked this video, please hit the like and subscribe button for more.